Welcome to an exploration of one of the most unsettling cases ever documented in the state of West Virginia. Before we start, I'd like to invite you to share in the comments exactly where you're watching from, along with the precise time you're hearing this narration. We're genuinely curious about which locations and what moments of the day or night these accounts manage to reach. Nestled in the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains, at the meeting point of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers, there lies a town whose stormy past extends well beyond John Brown's legendary raid. The year is 1896 in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. It was an era when the shrill whistle of steam engines echoed throughout the valley and the Civil War was still a fresh and painful memory for the local populace. It was in this location, within a white clapboard house that overlooked the river confluence, where the Blackwood sisters ran what the locals considered the finest boarding house the county had to offer. Their well-known hospitality was rivaled only by the puzzling disappearances that plagued their establishment, vanishing acts that wouldn't be linked together until many decades later. According to county records, from 1892 through 1896, no fewer than 7 travelers who lodged at the Blackwood house simply vanished without a trace. Their personal belongings, though, would sometimes reappear. A pocket watch might turn up here, a pair of spectacles there, consistently found in the possession of one of the 3 sisters who managed the place. When inquiries were made, they would mention guests leaving early, frequently before sunrise, and leaving behind personal items as settlement for unpaid bills. The local sheriff, Thomas Harlow, who happened to be the sisters' cousin by marriage, never pushed these matters any further. The tale of the Blackwood sisters remained tucked away in courthouse archives until 1953. That's when Professor James Whitaker from Georgetown University stumbled upon a collection of ledgers while doing research for his book about post-Civil War commerce in the Shenandoah Valley. His discovery set him on a trail that would eventually be closed off by a government directive in 1968, following his own unexplained disappearance. What you're about to hear is an account assembled from documents that survived, newspaper cuttings, and conversations with descendants of those who called Harpers Ferry home during those 4 pivotal years. The evidence suggests a narrative steeped in isolation, desperation, and humanity's darkest impulses, where a welcoming facade concealed deliberate cruelty and where an excellent meal frequently served as the introduction to something considerably more malevolent. The Blackwood name had deep roots in Jefferson County stretching back to the early 1800s. Property records from 1823 reveal that Jeremiah Blackwood, a Baltimore merchant, acquired 20 acres that overlooked the rivers, including the land where the house would eventually stand. The deed, still preserved in county files, characterizes the land as a superior property with magnificent views of where the rivers meet and convenient access to the main road. Jeremiah's business ledgers, partially kept in the Jefferson County Historical Society's collection, indicate he built a thriving dry goods business on Shenandoah Street, bringing in premium fabrics and household merchandise from cities out east. St. Peter's Catholic Church records show the Blackwoods were prominent congregation members, giving generously to the construction of a new church building in 1833. Jeremiah's wife Catherine gets frequent mentions in ladies' auxiliary meeting minutes for arranging charity efforts for the less fortunate and hosting social gatherings for influential families. By 1840, tax records reveal the Blackwoods had expanded their holdings beyond their original property and store. They now also owned a small farm outside of town plus multiple rental units along High Street. A business directory published in Baltimore in 1842 described Jeremiah Blackwood as one of the most important merchants in the growing Riverside community, whose establishment offered premium goods to Jefferson County's distinguished families. Their son William, who arrived in 1821, was sent east for schooling, initially to a Philadelphia Prep Academy and subsequently to Harvard College, where alumni documents verify his graduation in 1842. After completing his education, William came back to Harpers Ferry and slowly assumed control of the family enterprises as his father aged. Upon Jeremiah's death in 1852, William received the entire family fortune, which by then ranked as one of Jefferson County's largest private estates. William's marriage to Elizabeth Hollister in 1853 brought together 2 notable local families. The wedding, as noted in a brief announcement in the Virginia Free Press, drew the region's most distinguished figures, among them members of the prominent Washburn, Storr, and Lockwood families. Elizabeth was characterized as a woman of cultured upbringing and significant personal wealth, having studied at the prestigious Troy Female Seminary in New York. The newlyweds established their home in the family residence overlooking the rivers, which William had significantly upgraded following his father's passing. Building permits submitted to the county reveal substantial additions, such as a third floor, expanded kitchen facilities, and modern plumbing, uncommon luxuries for that era. By all accounts, the Blackwoods lived the life one would expect from the regional gentry, hosting dinners, attending church, and taking part in the customary social activities of affluent families. Their first daughter Margaret was born in 1854, followed by Eleanor in 1858 and Ruth in 1863. Baptismal documents from St. Peter's show each child received christening with considerable ceremony, with godparents chosen from the area's most prominent families. School documents indicate the girls received early education from private tutors brought in from Baltimore and Philadelphia, another indicator of the family's status and financial means. The Civil War completely transformed circumstances for the Blackwoods, just as it did for numerous families throughout the border states. William Blackwood, who had taken over the family estate from his father in 1852, made a crucial choice in April 1861. When Virginia decided to secede from the Union, Jefferson County, which would later join West Virginia, found itself deeply split. William, who had attended northern schools and maintained considerable business interests in Baltimore and Philadelphia, chose to back the Union. Military documents indicate William Blackwood accepted a commission as lieutenant colonel with the 2nd West Virginia Volunteer Infantry in July 1861. He served with distinction, taking part in the Shenandoah Valley campaigns under General Sheridan and receiving a wound at the Battle of Cedar Creek in October 1864. Letters from William addressed to Elizabeth, preserved in a private collection given to the West Virginia State Archives in 1947, expose his inner conflict. He wrote that he could not in good conscience endorse dissolving the Great Republic. Even though he recognized his stance placed Elizabeth and their children in a tough position locally, he prayed that reconciliation might be possible once the conflict ended. These same letters additionally show that the Blackwood enterprises suffered significantly during William's absence. In correspondence from June 1863, he expressed distress about the store's declining trade, though he understood many who previously considered themselves friends now took their business elsewhere. He counseled enduring this trial with dignity and patience, as they had others. By 1864, matters had deteriorated further. A September letter conveyed his distress at hearing the rental properties now stood vacant and that Elizabeth had been forced to let the household staff go. He asked her to assure Martha and Joseph they would be welcomed back when things improved. Throughout the conflict, Harpers Ferry changed hands repeatedly, with both Union and Confederate forces occupying this strategic town. The Blackwood home, given its prominent position overlooking the rivers, was taken over for officers' quarters on several occasions. A damage claim submitted to the federal government in 1866 detailed extensive destruction to the property, including furniture ruined, walls defaced, windows broken, and household goods stolen by troops from both sides. However, William's homecoming wasn't the triumphant return he might have envisioned. Local sentiment had leaned heavily toward the Confederacy, and those who backed the Union often found themselves treated as traitors. The Blackwood family became social outcasts in a community they had once helped build. Reverend Samuel Woodson, pastor of the Presbyterian Church the Blackwoods had attended for generations, recorded in his personal journal in September 1865 that Colonel Blackwood attended services for the first time since coming home. Several families rose and left as he entered. His wife seemed distressed, but the colonel kept his composure. The 3 daughters sat extremely still like little statues. He wondered what effect this treatment might have on such young minds. This ostracism continued for years. Business ledgers from that era reveal that local merchants regularly charged the Blackwoods inflated prices or turned down credit they routinely offered other families of comparable standing. Invitations to social functions ceased arriving. The once prominent family withdrew into growing isolation. A diary maintained by Harriet Stanton, a neighbor whose family stayed on friendly terms with the Blackwoods, offers perspective on their deteriorating social situation. She wrote about taking tea with Elizabeth. The house, once so alive with activity and guests, now stood silent. The girls were maturing without proper social contact or friends their own age. Elizabeth admitted they hadn't received any invitations to the summer gatherings. The colonel spent his days in his study with books and bourbon. One felt the weight of their isolation just crossing the threshold. Elizabeth Blackwood, the colonel's wife, seemed to endure this isolation most acutely. Dr. Theodore Lambert's medical journal from 1872 contains several entries regarding her condition. He noted Mrs. B continued displaying symptoms of nervous exhaustion and melancholia. She mentioned hearing whispers while in town and believed former acquaintances were conspiring against the family. The colonel reported she had started spending whole days in her bedroom with the curtains drawn. Lambert's journal tracks Elizabeth's deteriorating mental state. In April 1873, he recorded that Mrs. B now completely refused to leave the house. She had developed peculiar habits, insisted on checking the locks numerous times each night, and believed neighbors were watching the house from beyond the garden. She had lost substantial weight due to poor appetite. By November 1874, Lambert noted Mrs. B's condition continued worsening. She now showed paranoid delusions about the household food, believing unknown enemies were trying to poison the family, and had taken over preparing all meals herself. Despite this being previously the staff's responsibility, the colonel reported she would not let the daughters eat anything she hadn't personally prepared and tasted first. In February 1875, Lambert noted the most troubling development yet in Mrs. B's case. She now experienced auditory hallucinations, voices telling her to protect her daughters from unspecified threats. She had taken to sleeping outside their bedroom door. Her personal hygiene was severely neglected. Lambert suggested institutional care, but the colonel refused to consider it at present. By 1876, Elizabeth's condition had deteriorated to the point where home care was impossible. Records from Western State Hospital in Staunton, Virginia, confirm her admission on June 12, 1876, with a diagnosis of severe melancholia with paranoid features. The admitting physician observed that the patient believed her food was being poisoned by neighbors, displayed extreme agitation when meals were served, and had lost considerable weight from refusing to eat. The hospital's quarterly reports to Colonel Blackwood, copies kept in Dr. Lambert's files, indicate little improvement in Elizabeth's condition over time. In September 1876, they noted the patient remained withdrawn and suspicious, accepted only minimal nourishment, and needed close monitoring to guarantee adequate intake. She refused to participate in occupational therapy or social activities. By December 1877, the patient had developed ritual behaviors around food consumption, would only eat after elaborate preparation and inspection of everything, and had accused hospital staff of colluding with unnamed enemies. Sedation was occasionally required during episodes of extreme agitation. In March 1879, they reported no significant improvement. The patient now spoke rarely, even to attending physicians, continued expressing belief she had been committed to prevent her from protecting her daughters from harm. Requests to see her children had become less frequent. Elizabeth stayed institutionalized until her death in 1883. Hospital records characterize her as withdrawn and uncommunicative during her entire stay, though nurses observed she brightened somewhat during the infrequent visits from her daughters. The colonel visited only twice in 7 years, claiming the demands of managing the family properties alone prevented more frequent travel. The death certificate attributes the cause to general failure of health consequent to self-starvation, implying Elizabeth's food-related paranoia ultimately contributed to her death. She was buried in the Blackwood family plot in Harpers Ferry, though funeral records indicate the service was sparsely attended, another indication of the family's ongoing social isolation. The 3 daughters, Margaret, Eleanor, and Ruth, were mostly left to their own devices during these difficult years. School records from Jefferson Academy show all 3 were exceptional students, with Margaret particularly gifted in mathematics and accounting. Her term papers, preserved in the Academy's archives, reveal an unusual focus on financial management and investment strategies, topics rarely pursued by young women of that period. Eleanor displayed talent in domestic arts, as demonstrated by her prize-winning embroidery exhibited at the Jefferson County Fair in 1872. The local newspaper characterized her work as showing exceptional precision and attention to detail, with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible to the naked eye. Her teachers noted her perfectionist tendencies, with one evaluation commenting that Miss Eleanor would unpick and restart her work multiple times until achieving the exact result she wanted, showing unusual patience for someone so young. Ruth's aptitude for chemistry was noted by several teachers. An essay written by Ruth at age 13, preserved in the Academy's archives, reveals an unusual interest in food preparation and preservation, particularly meats. Titled, On Modern Methods of Food Preservation and Their Chemical Foundations, the essay demonstrates knowledge well beyond expectations for a student her age. Her science instructor added a note about her unusually detailed understanding of organic decomposition for a student her age and a somewhat concerning focus on methods of preserving animal tissue. All three girls withdrew from formal education following their mother's hospitalization. Margaret was 18, Eleanor 14, and Ruth just 9 years old. The colonel apparently decided home education was preferable given the family's ongoing social isolation. He employed a series of tutors, though town records indicate none remained longer than a few months. One tutor, Miss Caroline Spencer, wrote to a friend in Baltimore in 1879 that the Blackwood girls were intelligent beyond their years, but something about the household was disquieting. The youngest especially asked questions no child should contemplate. The colonel was often absent, and the house maintained a silence that pressed upon one's spirits. She indicated she wouldn't renew her contract when the term ended. Another tutor, James Harrison, lasted only 6 weeks before departing without collecting his final wages. In a letter to his previous school's headmaster, he explained the situation at the Blackwood house wasn't as represented. The girls, while intellectually capable, displayed disturbing tendencies. The eldest managed household accounts with suspicious precision for someone her age. The middle child spent hours arranging and rearranging household items to achieve some order only she could discern. And the youngest, he couldn't adequately describe his discomfort with her preoccupations. She dissected small animals found on the property, claiming scientific interest, but the enthusiasm she displayed was most unseemly. The colonel, when present, was either indifferent or inebriated. He couldn't in good conscience continue. For the next 15 years, the Blackwood sisters lived in growing isolation. Neighbors reported seeing them only at church or during necessary trips to town for supplies. The family's once extensive social circle had shrunk to include only a few loyal friends and distant relatives who occasionally visited from out of town. Colonel Blackwood's health began to decline in the late 1880s. Dr. Lambert's journal mentions treating him for respiratory complaints and episodes of confusion and agitation, particularly at night. The doctor's notes from 1890 express concern about the colonel's mental state. The patient expressed belief that former Confederate soldiers were plotting to burn his house and had taken to keeping loaded firearms in every room. Lambert advised the daughters to secure these weapons as the colonel's hands shook considerably and he might pose a danger to himself or others. A particularly telling entry from November 1890 reads, "Call to the Blackwood house at midnight." The colonel had fired his revolver through the bedroom window, claiming he saw intruders in the garden. No evidence of any such presence. The daughters appeared remarkably calm throughout the incident. The eldest, Miss Margaret, explained such episodes were becoming common and inquired about stronger sedatives than Lambert had previously prescribed. Most curious was the youngest daughter's reaction. She observed the proceedings with what Lambert could only describe as clinical interest, as though studying her father's deterioration's progression. When Colonel Blackwood died in February 1891, the funeral was sparsely attended. The obituary in the Jefferson County Advocate was brief, noting his military service but little else. No cause of death was specified, though Dr. Lambert's private records indicate heart failure, possibly hastened by years of melancholia and excessive alcohol consumption. A more troubling note appears in Lambert's personal journal, never meant for public view. He wrote he wasn't entirely satisfied with the circumstances of the colonel's passing. He had been called to certify death in the early morning hours. The body was already prepared for burial by the daughters, unusual in itself. Miss Margaret cited the colonel's explicit wishes to avoid unnecessary handling. No obvious signs of violence or self-harm, though the daughter's composure was remarkable for those who had just lost their only remaining parent. When Lambert suggested a more thorough examination might be appropriate, Miss Ruth commented that further invasion of father's dignity would serve no purpose, as what's done is done. The phrasing struck him as peculiar. He signed the certificate as requested, though certain questions remained. The colonel's death left his daughters in a precarious financial position. Military pension records show his Union Army pension terminated upon his death. The family's once substantial holdings had diminished over the years as the colonel gradually sold off properties to maintain their lifestyle as business ventures failed. By 1891, only the house on the hill and a small amount of savings remained. Bank records from the Harpers Ferry National Bank, uncovered by Professor Whitaker in 1954, show the Blackwood account contained just $237.42 at the time of the colonel's death, insufficient to maintain 3 unmarried women for more than a few months in even modest circumstances. Yet within a year, regular deposits began to appear, eventually growing to substantial sums that allowed the sisters not only to maintain their household but to make significant property improvements. It was Margaret, the eldest and most practical of the sisters, who proposed converting the family home into a boarding house. Her letter to the Jefferson County clerk requesting the appropriate business license, dated March 7, 1892, states their location near the railway station and the quality of accommodations they could provide should attract a respectable clientele of travelers requiring temporary lodging. They anticipated primarily serving businessmen and tourists visiting Harpers Ferry's historical sites. The Blackwood home's transformation was swift and thorough. Local carpenter Joseph Winters was hired to modify the interior, creating additional bedrooms from the formerly spacious family quarters and improving the plumbing to accommodate paying guests. His invoice, preserved in county records, includes an unusual item: reinforcement of basement ceiling beams and installation of specialized drainage system as per Miss Blackwood's specifications. The invoice was significantly higher than typical renovation costs of the period, suggesting extensive modifications beyond standard boarding house requirements. Winters later commented to his apprentice Timothy Hayes about the basement work's unusual nature. Hayes, interviewed by Professor Whitaker in 1954, recalled Winters saying it was the strangest job he'd ever done. Miss Margaret had very specific requirements. She wanted a floor drain connected directly to the river. She wanted ceiling hooks that could support substantial weight. She wanted one section's walls lined with copper sheeting. Winters said he didn't ask questions because the pay was good, but he never felt right about it. Hayes added a detail that caught Whitaker's attention. Winters told him they brought in special equipment from Baltimore, a large cast iron table with channels running to the edges and a center drain. It took 4 men to move it into the basement. Miss Margaret said it was for laundry purposes, but Winters said he'd never seen a laundry table made that way, with restraining brackets along the edges and that particular drainage setup. He said it reminded him more of equipment he'd seen in a slaughterhouse when he did renovation work for the Shepherd family's butcher shop in Charlestown. By May 1892, the Blackwood house was open for business. An advertisement in the Baltimore Sun described it as a superior establishment offering clean, comfortable rooms and home-cooked meals of exceptional quality, conveniently located within walking distance of the Harpers Ferry train station, with weekly and monthly rates available for extended stays. Similar advertisements appeared in Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and Richmond newspapers, suggesting the sisters were casting a wide net for potential guests. The emphasis in all advertisements was consistent: exceptional accommodations, superior dining, and the proprietress's personal attention. One notice in the Philadelphia Inquirer specifically mentioned being particularly well suited for gentlemen traveling on business who appreciate fine cuisine and attentive service in a home-like setting. The business appeared to thrive immediately. Tax records show a significant increase in the sisters' income during the first year of operation. What's curious, however, is that this financial success came despite relatively few guest register entries. According to Professor Whitaker's notes, the register showed an average occupancy rate of only 30%, far too low to account for the reported income. The discrepancy might be explained by an entry in Margaret Blackwood's private ledger, discovered among the materials sealed in 1968. A notation from September 1892 reads she had determined that official registration of all guests created unnecessary documentation. Those selected for special hospitality would be recorded in this private ledger only. This arrangement should minimize complications should inquiries arise. Local merchants began to notice the sisters' purchasing patterns almost immediately. Thomas Wilson's grandfather, who owned the general store on High Street, kept meticulous records of the sisters' orders. His ledger shows regular purchases of unusual items, lie in bulk quantities, specialized knives, multiple sets of fine bone china that were regularly replaced, and uncharacteristically large amounts of certain spices, particularly those known to mask other flavors. Wilson shared his grandfather's observations with Professor Whitaker. Granddad said the Blackwood sisters bought more preserving salt than any family he'd ever seen, even those putting up meat for winter, and they bought it year-round, not just during butchering season. When he asked Miss Margaret about it once, she just smiled and said they had special preservation needs for their kitchen. The hardware store owned by the Jenkins family supplied another piece of the puzzle. Their sales records show the sisters purchased unusual quantities of locks, chains, and heavy-duty restraints of the type typically used for securing livestock. When questioned, they explained these items were necessary for securing the basement storage room, where they kept their valuable supplies and family heirlooms. The first documented disappearance connected to the Blackwood house occurred in February 1893, approximately 9 months after the boarding house opened. Howard Phillips, a timber merchant from Baltimore, arrived on February 14 for what was intended to be a 3-night stay while he negotiated purchasing rights to a tract of forest in the nearby Blue Ridge. According to the guest register, he checked out on February 17, having paid his bill in full. Phillips's family, however, reported him missing when he failed to return to Baltimore. A telegraph sent to Sheriff Harlow on February 20 asked for any information regarding Phillips's whereabouts. Harlow's reply, preserved in Baltimore police archives, stated simply that Mr. Phillips departed Harpers Ferry by morning train on February 17, according to boarding house proprietors, with no further information available. What makes this case particularly interesting is a notation found in Margaret Blackwood's private ledger discovered by Professor Whitaker among the materials sealed in 1968. The entry for February 17 reads, "Mr. P. settled his account in full. Personal effects of adequate quality. Ruth particularly pleased with the watch fob. Eleanor has claimed the leather satchel for conversion to household use." A more disturbing entry follows on February 18, Ruth's special preparation. Most successful. Guests at dinner commented specifically on the roast's tenderness. Eleanor's new preservation technique appears effective. No detectable odor or discoloration. We'll continue with this method for future special preparations. The banking records for the Blackwood house show a deposit of $243.75 on February 18, significantly more than the standard room and board rate would have generated from a single guest's 3-night stay. This pattern of unexplained financial windfalls following guest disappearances would continue throughout the boarding house's operation. A similar pattern emerged with the disappearance of Edward Cartwright, a land speculator from Philadelphia, in June 1893. Cartwright arrived on June 10 and was recorded as having departed on June 13. His family reported him missing on June 20 after he failed to return home and missed several important business appointments. Sheriff Harlow's investigation consisted of a brief visit to the Blackwood house where he accepted his cousin's explanation that Mr. Cartwright had mentioned plans to visit properties in the Shenandoah Valley before returning to Philadelphia. No further inquiry was made despite Cartwright's horse and carriage remaining unclaimed at the local livery stable for several weeks. Margaret's ledger entry for June 13 notes Mr. C's account settled. Gold pocket watch of superior quality. Eleanor finds his walking stick useful for reaching high shelves. Ruth pleased with his boots' quality, though too large for any of us. A subsequent entry dated June 14 elaborates, Ruth experimenting with new marinade for special preparation. Results excellent. Diners commented the meat was more flavorful than previous offerings. Must remember, subjects who consume alcohol regularly require additional soaking time to remove bitter undertones. Over the next 3 years, similar entries would appear in Margaret's ledger, always coinciding with guests later reported missing. The pattern was consistent. Businessmen traveling alone, carrying cash, with no local connections. They would arrive, stay for 2 or 3 nights, and then supposedly depart early in the morning when no witnesses were present. The sisters' operation continued without raising suspicion, protected by their reputation as respectable spinsters and their family's long-standing, if complicated, position in the community. Their neighbor to the east, Widow Harrison, later recalled those girls were so quiet, so proper, always nodded politely when passing on the street, kept that house immaculate. You could see the windows shining from across the river. Never would have thought they had it in them, though there was something about Ruth's eyes that never seemed right to her, too calculating for a woman so young. Another neighbor, Franklin Myers, whose property adjoined the Blackwood house to the north, told Professor Whitaker sometimes at night he'd hear noises coming from their place, not like a party or guests talking, more like furniture being moved, heavy things being dragged, and once or twice he could swear he heard a sort of mechanical sound, like a pulley or winch operating, always late at night, well after decent folks were asleep. He mentioned it to Sheriff Harlow once, but Harlow said the ladies probably just suffered from insomnia and were rearranging their furniture. Myers added a detail he had previously withheld. There was one night, must have been the summer of '95, when he was out late checking on his livestock during a thunderstorm. He saw lights in the Blackwood basement windows, which was unusual at that hour. Lightning flashed and he caught a glimpse of something through the window that he'd tried to forget ever since. It looked like the youngest sister, Ruth, working at some kind of table. She had her back to the window, but he could see she was wearing something like a butcher's apron, all stained dark. There was something on the table in front of her, something large. The lightning stopped, and he couldn't see clearly anymore. He told himself it was just the storm playing tricks on his eyes. Never mentioned it to anyone until now. The Blackwood sisters maintained strict roles within their business. Margaret, the eldest, handled all financial matters and guest registration. Eleanor managed the housekeeping and linens, and Ruth, the youngest, maintained complete control over the kitchen and dining room. This division of labor allowed each sister to control her domain with minimal oversight from the others, an arrangement that would later prove significant when authorities attempted to determine individual culpability. Sarah Jenkins, who briefly worked as a maid at the Blackwood house in 1894, provided a rare glimpse into daily operations. In an interview conducted in 1955, the elderly Jenkins recalled Miss Margaret was always at the desk, watching who came and went. She had a way of sizing up the gentlemen as they arrived, looking at their clothes, their luggage, their hands. Some she would greet warmly, others more coolly. The ones she was particularly nice to were always the ones who left early and weren't seen again. Jenkins continued, Miss Eleanor was in charge of the rooms, very particular about the linens. They had to be perfectly white. Sometimes she'd find stains on sheets or towels, and Eleanor would take them from her immediately, saying she would handle them personally, never let her near the washing when certain items needed cleaning. Jenkins also described the peculiar system Eleanor had developed for tracking linens. She had this book where she recorded every item, how many times it had been washed, when it had been purchased, when it needed replacement. If a sheet or tablecloth had been used for what Eleanor called special service, it was marked with a small red thread in the hem. Those items were always washed separately, and Miss Eleanor handled them herself. Most revealing were Jenkins's observations about Ruth Blackwood. Miss Ruth was strangest of all. She wouldn't allow anyone in her kitchen while she was preparing meals. The dishes she served looked and smelled wonderful, but there was something off about some of them, a sweetness that didn't belong, or a texture that wasn't quite right. When guests complimented her cooking, she would watch them eating with this intense look, not pleased exactly, more hungry. Ruth's culinary skills were apparently remarkable. A rare surviving letter from a guest who departed safely, dated August 1894, mentions the meals alone are worth the lodging price. Ms. Ruth's roast was unlike any he had tasted, tender beyond imagining, with a flavor both familiar and exotic. When he inquired about her technique, she smiled and said only that proper preparation is everything, and that patience yields rewards in the kitchen, as in life. He had dined in the finest establishments in New York and Philadelphia, yet found himself craving the dishes served at the Blackwood table. Jenkins left the Blackwood house after only 3 months of employment. She told Miss Margaret she was needed at home to care for her ailing mother, she explained. The truth was the place made her skin crawl, especially the basement. She was forbidden to go down there, but once she needed to fetch preserves, and Miss Ruth was out. The shelves were full of jars, but they didn't contain what you'd expect. She didn't look closely, didn't want to, but what she glimpsed didn't look like any fruit or vegetable she'd ever seen. She left the next day and never went back. As 1896 approached, the pattern of disappearances accelerated. Between January and September of that year, 4 men vanished after staying at the Blackwood house. Local merchants began to notice unusual purchasing patterns that went beyond what they had observed in previous years. Ruth Blackwood's special order placed with Harpers Ferry Apothecary in July 1896 was particularly telling. The partial receipt recovered from the apothecary's records lists compounds that had legitimate medicinal uses, but in combination and in certain quantities could produce powerful sedative effects. The apothecary's notation on the receipt reads, "For treatment of Miss Ruth's continued nervous condition as prescribed." No doctor's prescription was found, and Dr. Lambert's records contain no mention of treating Ruth for any nervous disorder. The apothecary's apprentice, Samuel Cooper, later told Professor Whitaker Miss Ruth had very specific requirements. She wanted to know exactly how much of each compound would produce deep relaxation without causing permanent harm. She asked about chemicals that would preserve freshness in meat during summer months. She had an unusual interest in various salts and their effects on human tissue. Always paid in cash, always insisted on discretion. Cooper added a detail he had previously withheld. Once while preparing her order, he asked about a particular compound's purpose, potassium bromide, as it was unusual to request it in such quantities. She looked at him with the coldest eyes he'd ever seen and said, "To ensure restful sleep, of course. Some require more assistance than others to achieve the proper state of repose." The way she said it made his skin crawl. After that, he never questioned her orders again. The sisters' business continued to prosper despite the economic downturn affecting much of the region in the mid-1890s. Bank records show regular deposits, often in cash, well beyond what their documented occupancy rates would suggest. They made several significant purchases during this period, including new kitchen equipment, improved plumbing fixtures, and a specially designed icebox from a Philadelphia manufacturer that, according to the shipping manifest, was constructed to maintain temperatures suitable for extended preservation of perishable materials. As summer faded into autumn, the sisters' activities might have continued unchecked if not for the arrival of a particular guest. On September 18, 1896, the evening train from Baltimore brought a man who signed the guest register as Dr. Ephraim Samuels, identifying himself as a dental surgeon relocating to establish a practice in nearby Martinsburg. According to the register, Dr. Samuels paid for a full week's lodging in advance, an amount that would have represented a substantial cash sum. He was assigned the blue room on the second floor, which overlooked the garden at the rear of the house. The sisters could not have known that this man was not Dr. Samuels. County records later revealed that the real Dr. Ephraim Samuels had died 3 months earlier in Baltimore. The man who arrived at Blackwood House that September evening was James Pinkerton, a private detective hired by the family of Howard Phillips, the businessman who had disappeared in February 1893. Pinkerton came to Harpers Ferry after months of investigation that had led him to identify a pattern of disappearances connected to the boarding house. For 3 days, he maintained his cover as Dr. Samuels, taking meals with the sisters and observing their routines. In his personal journal, later recovered from his belongings in Baltimore, he noted the eldest spoke little during meals but observed constantly. The middle sister maintained pleasant conversation while watching one's reaction to the food. The youngest served each dish personally, always waiting until guests took the first bite before retreating to the kitchen. The meals were exceptional, perhaps too much so. There was an unusual aftertaste to the evening wine that he had been careful to only pretend to consume. Pinkerton's journal entries grow increasingly concerned over his 3-day stay. The second night, dinner consisted of a roast that Miss Ruth described as locally sourced game. The texture was unusual, not like any venison or rabbit he'd encountered. The sisters watched with particular intensity as the other guest, a Mr. Carrington from Richmond, consumed 2 large portions with evident enjoyment. Pinkerton claimed a headache and ate sparingly. Mr. Carrington became noticeably drowsy during dessert and was helped to his room by Miss Eleanor. When Pinkerton inquired after him at breakfast, he was told Mr. Carrington had checked out before dawn to catch the early train. His final entry, dated September 21, 1896, reads he was now certain of his suspicions. He had observed basement windows from the garden, unusual equipment visible, a metal table with drainage system, large preservation containers along walls, hooks in the ceiling with pulley system. He would implement his plan tonight. If he did not report to the Baltimore office by noon tomorrow, Agent Thompson should proceed with contingency arrangements. On the evening of September 21, Pinkerton enacted his plan to discover what happened to guests who never departed. After dinner, he he feigned greater intoxication than usual, slurring his words and having difficulty climbing the stairs to his room. The sisters helped him to bed, with Margaret assuring him a good night's sleep would set everything right. What happened next exists only in Pinkerton's report filed with the Baltimore police and subsequently sealed until its discovery in 1962. According to his account, Pinkerton waited until approximately midnight when he heard footsteps in the hallway. His door opened and in the dim light he observed Margaret and Eleanor entering with what he described as a large canvas sheet, several lengths of rope, and a collection of knives and other implements of a concerning nature. Pinkerton, who had not actually consumed the drugged food or wine but had discreetly disposed of it, confronted the women. The confrontation that followed was not recorded in detail as the relevant pages were removed from his report before it was sealed. What is known is that Pinkerton left Harpers Ferry abruptly the following morning and returned to Baltimore where he filed his report and then disappeared from historical record entirely. A tantalizing clue to what might have transpired during the confrontation comes from a single paragraph that survived in Pinkerton's report. When questioned directly about the fate of Mr. Phillips and the others, the elder Miss B exhibited no shame or denial. She stated with perfect composure that waste is a sin and that men of means who travel alone are seldom immediately missed. When he suggested authorities would be interested in her philosophy, she indicated that her family's connections would prevent any serious inquiry, as had been the case previously. The look in her eyes convinced him that removing himself from the premises immediately was the wisest course of action. Even more disturbing is a notation found in a margin of the report, apparently added later by Pinkerton. Miss R appeared in the doorway during the confrontation, carried a large cleaver, smiled in a most unsettling manner, and suggested he might contribute to the household in ways other than financial. The elder sister ordered her back to the kitchen. Pinkerton believed his survival was due solely to the precaution of informing the Baltimore office of his whereabouts and suspicions before arrival. The Pinkerton Detective Agency's internal records, partially opened to researchers in 1967, contain a curious entry dated September 23, 1896. Agent Pinkerton returned from the Harpers Ferry assignment. He submitted a written report and verbal briefing. He exhibited unusual agitation. He requested immediate reassignment to Western Territories. The request was granted. The file was sealed by order of senior management. 3 days after Pinkerton's departure, the Jefferson County Advocate published a small notice. The Blackwood sisters had closed their boarding establishment indefinitely due to family matters requiring their attention elsewhere. The house stood empty for several months before being sold to a family from Washington, D.C. who reported finding the premises in immaculate condition, as though thoroughly cleaned before departure. Edward Collins, the real estate agent who handled the sale, later recalled the house was spotless, unnaturally so for a building that had been vacant for months. No dust, no cobwebs. The basement had been completely whitewashed, floor, walls, ceiling, and smelled strongly of lye. The kitchen had all new equipment, perfectly clean pots and pans that looked as though they'd never been used. Most strange was the garden. It had been dug up entirely, and